In this lesson, we'll learn some basic workflows for creating objects in perspective, as well as how we can transform these objects. Alright, so in the previous lesson, we learned how we can manipulate our perspective grid using the perspective grid tool and these little widgets and controls that you see here around our artboard. Now, let's go ahead and begin creating some objects in perspective here. So there's essentially two different workflows for creating artwork and then giving it perspective. So the first workflow is going to be just to draw this artwork directly onto our perspective grid. And we can do this with any number of different tools. So let's come up here to our line segment tool. And let's go ahead and click and hold down on that and check out all the tools underneath it. So all these tools in this line segment tools tool group here in our tool panel can be used to draw objects directly into perspective. So let's go ahead and snap this out. Now, also, let's go ahead and take a look at our rectangle tools tool group here. You can see here there's several tools nested underneath it as well. Now, all of these tools, with the exception of the flare tool, can also be used to draw objects right into perspective. So let's go ahead and snap that out as well. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my rectangle tool here. And I tell you what, let's take a look at our cursor for just a moment. You see here there is sort of a little tip here in the bottom right corner of our cursor, and it looks like a little vertical line with an arrow pointing to the left. That is a little visual indicator for you that, hey, you have the left grid plane selected as your active grid plane. Now, that tip is going to be there for any of these tools that you select that you want to draw with. Now, if we can come over here and select a different grid plane here, and that little tip is going to change. See, we now have an arrow pointing to the right. So if we select the horizontal grid plane, we have an arrow pointing down. So that's just a really nice little visual indicator there when you're drawing right into perspective as to what plane you have selected as the active plane. So let's go ahead and grab our rectangle tool here, and let's go ahead and draw in a rectangle here on our left grid plane. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that in. Let's go ahead and hold Shift so we can draw a perfect square. Alright, so we've drawn a square in perspective on this left grid plane. Now, let's go ahead and grab our selection tool using the keyboard shortcut V. Now, if you're familiar with Illustrator, you're probably familiar with both the selection and direct selection tools and how we can use those to move objects around and transform objects. Now, we can actually still use those two tools here in the perspective grid, but it's not going to maintain its perspective if we transform or move this object with one of those two tools. So you can see here if I move this off and away using the selection tool, now the perspective's broken. It doesn't seem to fit into our perspective anymore. So let's go ahead and undo that. So the tool you need to be familiar with in drawing in perspective and working in perspective here is the perspective selection tool. This is the tool you're going to use most of the time to accomplish what you need. So let's go ahead and select that here. It's a pretty easy keyboard shortcut to remember in that it's Shift V. So we'll go ahead and grab this perspective selection tool, and you can see again we have that little visual indicator. So let's go ahead and zoom in our object here, and let's move it around. You can see here we can now move that around the left grid plane, and it's going to respect the perspective that we've already established here. So we can move that around anywhere on that plane, and that shape is going to resize according to the perspective grid. So let's go ahead and talk about transforming this object now. So if you're familiar with transforming objects in Illustrator, you've probably seen and worked with a bounding box before. And you can see that this object has one as well. So if this were a normal object with the selection tool, you'd be able to grab any one of these little controls around the object and move it around, transform it however you want to. Well, the perspective selection tool is going to work very, very similar to the normal selection tool when it comes to a bounding box. We can grab, say, this corner control here, and we can stretch this box out. We can actually hold down Shift to constrain the proportions so we maintain that perfect square. And we can hold down Shift and Alt to transform that object from its center, just like so. About the only thing that's visually missing here from the bounding box when you're working with the perspective selection tool is you can't rotate an object by mousing over the corner. That little arrow doesn't come up. So let's go ahead and undo those two transformations. Now we can also hold down our Alt key and we can copy an object and float that off to the side, just like so. Now, again, the same keyboard shortcuts that work with copying normal objects are going to work here. So if we copy this and hold down Shift, we can constrain the movement of the new object to 45-degree angles. You can see we can move it straight to the left, we can move it straight up, or we can move it off at an angle up to the left or any direction really. So the same really functionality of transforming objects still exists with this new perspective selection tool. So I tell you what, let's go ahead and begin creating sort of a box here. Let's go ahead and just drag down one of these shapes into the corner here at our origin or our 0, 0 point. And let's go ahead and talk about creating maybe the face of the box that's opposite our camera here, the one that faces this vanishing point back here. What we need to do is we need to create another shape just like this one that is further back from this one. We need to create some perpendicular movement between these two and basically create the back side of this box. Well, we can do that by, with this object selected, reaching down here and grabbing our left grid plane control, and let's go ahead and hold down the Alt key, and we can drag that control out. But what it's doing, it's also dragging a copy of that object we had selected. So let's go ahead and undo that. We can also hold down Alt and Shift, and we can constrain that copy again to the grid lines we've established, just like so. And we can create a perpendicular copy of this one further back and away. Now you may notice here that, well, we've created that perpendicular copy, but we've messed up our left grid plane. It's no longer running right down here through the origin of our grid. So I tell you what, there's actually a better way to do this. Let's go ahead and undo that. And let's move that back to the origin here. Now, instead of messing with the grid plane control, we can also use a keyboard shortcut to create some perpendicular movement or a perpendicular copy of this object. Let's go ahead and hold down the keyboard shortcut 5. And we'll just see what that does. Alright, you can see here that we've moved that object seemingly further away towards this vanishing point right here. That object is moved perpendicular to its original position. So by holding down the keyboard shortcut 5, we can adjust the perpendicular position of that object. Let me go ahead and undo that here, and let's go ahead and hold down Alt and the keyboard shortcut 5. Now, the keyboard shortcut 5 is the number right along the top of your keyboard. So I'm going to hold that down, and let's go ahead and create a copy of this object, just like so. Now, we've created our copy, but the only thing that we really lack in using that keyboard shortcut is we can't add Shift to that to constrain it to the grid lines we've established. So let's go ahead and move that just a little bit closer here because I want to show you a potential problem. Now, this is where Illustrator falls short of 3D applications. Let me go ahead and just change the color of that object. Now, you can see here that while we were able to create a sense of depth by creating that copy perpendicular from the original, now Illustrator doesn't really understand the stacking order and how that should be affected by that copy. So Illustrator still thinks this one is on top. So we actually have to change that stacking order. You can use the keyboard shortcut to send this one backwards of Control Open Bracket, or you could come up here and choose Object Arrange and choose Send Backwards right there. If you've worked with Illustrator, you're pretty familiar with the stacking order and how to change that. So I tend to use keyboard shortcuts for that, both Control Shift or Control Open Bracket and Control Shift Open Bracket to send all the way to the back. So I'll probably be using keyboard shortcuts from here on out. So we've created that next side of our cube here, and I tell you what, let's go ahead and deselect that here, and let's talk about creating maybe this side of the cube right here that goes on our right grid plane. Well, we could actually come up here and just select the right grid plane from our grid switching widget here, or our plane switching widget, and just draw it right in there. Or we could make a copy of this one and move it from this left grid plane to the right grid plane. Let's go ahead and do that here. I'm going to go ahead and hold down Alt to drag out a copy, and you can see I've got it there. And now while holding Alt and while dragging this object, I'm going to go ahead and use the keyboard shortcut to switch my active grid plane to that right plane. Remember, that keyboard shortcut is 3. So we're going to pull this one out, hold down the 3, and you can see that we have changed that object over to its new grid plane. So let me just snap that into position. I am using Smart Guides, so if you don't have those turned on, the keyboard shortcut for that is Control U, or you can find that under View and Smart Guides right there. So we've created yet another side of our box. So let's go ahead and just change that colors here. Alright, so we've got 3 sides of our box created, and we've just learned how to move an object from one grid plane to another. Now we have some options when it comes to the back side of this box here. We could actually use this square that we've already drawn, and we could change it over and adjust its position and move it to this right grid plane, or we can just select this object right here, and let's make a copy of it and move it back perpendicular to the original here. So we'll just hold down Alt and 5 and move that into position right there. Now, again, the stacking order is a little bit messed up, so I'll just send that to the back. And you can see we've created yet another side of our box. Now, another cool feature of using the keyboard shortcut 5 to make a copy of an object perpendicular to the original is that we can also use the transform again command. So, I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and select this object. Let's hold down Alt and 5, and let's move a copy perpendicular to the original, just like so. And now let's come up here to Object, choose Transform, and let's go for this Transform Again command here. Notice it's Control-D is the keyboard shortcut. And you can see here that we've made another copy, and we can do that and continue repeating that just like so. So that Transform Again command can actually be pretty cool and pretty useful when it comes to creating copies like that. So let me just undo that here. Alright, so we've discussed one workflow for creating artwork in perspective. Now, that's to draw it directly onto our perspective grid. Now, I've got here some objects over to the left that are flat, and I created here outside of the perspective we've already established. Now, another workflow for creating art on our perspective grid is to create it flat like this and then bring it onto our grid. So, and that's really simple to do. So, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time doing that in this lesson, because we're actually going to spend quite a bit of time in the next lesson beginning to build something using perspective. So I'll tell you what, let's just go ahead and grab one of these objects, and using our perspective selection tool, notice here that we have the right grid plane selected. As soon as I grab this object, it wants to assign it to that grid plane. So we can just swing that into position just like so on top of that right grid plane. So let's go ahead and assign perspective to a couple more of these objects. Just like so. And let's go ahead and select that horizontal grid plane. And whoop, I let go of that one a little too early. Let's go ahead and grab that shape and bring it on over here and assign it to that horizontal grid plane, just like so. So you can see how easy it is to take flat artwork and bring it onto our perspective grid so that it respects the perspective that we've established. Now, whichever method you choose to use is really up to you, depending on the project you're working on. Now, I would probably tend to use kind of a hybrid of both of these two workflows, and I tell you what, in the next lesson, we're going to actually begin working on a little bit of a project. When I think of perspective drawing, I immediately think of architecture. So we're going to be drawing a building here in perspective, and I've gone ahead and worked up some orthographic drawings here of a few of the views. We've got a side view of the building we're going to create, we've got a front view, and we've got a top view of the building. So we're going to actually be using some of these shapes that I've already drawn, bringing them into perspective, and creating a perspective drawing of this building. Alright, so in the next lesson we'll get started doing just that, and we'll begin with learning about precision object placement and precision object duplication.